Chapter 7. The Thunderpeel Fleet. Training Fleet 3 was distributed over more than 20 Zobear harbors. This was not done because it was called for by the operation. There was simply no one harbor that could accommodate the entire fleet. Of course, there were no constraints when it came to available space. That said, the star forces unfortunately didn't currently have enough ships to fill up a whole star system. The limiting factor was the production rate of antimatter fuel, which was consumed in large quantities by combat and combat exercises. As a general rule, each harbor was designated as a domain, that is, a star system lacking an inhabited planet. And since they did not have land worlds to support, they made a sizable surplus of antimatter fuel. Even more mobile antimatter fuel factories were planned and installed. Still, no single star system had the capacity to provide for all of the fleets under Lafayer's command. It was during the finishing stages that Fleet 3 amassed as a corps. The voyage to the Limskor Udor was the first and last action Training Fleet 3 ever took as a group. Training Fleet 3 was reborn as the Thunderpeel Fleet at the Limskor Udor, after which it was to migrate to the Timex Spotnebryber, Spotenbryuv astrobase. The planar space side of the Sodek Spotnebryber, Spotenbryuv portal, which was situated at the astrobase, was fairly close to the Wesko portal. And on the three-space side of the Wesko portal lay the Avriel Countdom and Lokvakar within it, both in enemy hands. The Empire had never made the transfer of the capital official, so even now, Lokvakar was still nominally the imperial capital. The 8 astrobases were stationed to protect the capital, but now they served as the first line of defense against an incursion from the capital. Of course, they could also serve as bases for recapturing it. If the enemy detected the fleet moving to the Spotenbryuv astrobase, the enemy might concentrate its forces in Lokvakar. The Star forces hoped that if that did come to pass, the PSSU's defenses would weaken as troops were drawn away from it. When the fleet parted with the mobile Imperial Palace and left the Limskor Udor, the troops had yet to be organized. Although it had already been decided, the announcement was made in the middle of the move. In the end, it was the 5-corps plan that was adopted, and the formation consisted of Bioer Kosna Rodrikater, Thunderpeel Fleet 1, to Fleet 5. The allocation of ships was decided nigh automatically. Analyses had been run more than a handful of times in advance. However, because Fleet 5 would be tasked with watching over and guarding the Wesko portal in addition to resupplying the whole armada, extra units were incorporated. The staff officers were bombarded by the work that came with this. The officers also had to arrange for the migration of the fleet's various corps. Suitable resupply points had to be posted in between the Limskor Udor and the Spotenbryuv astrobase. Of course, the existing facilities would be utilized, but they alone wouldn't be enough. The necessary fuel was secured by a combination of transferring fuel from the star systems outside the route in advance and stationing mobile antimatter fuel factories. Reshuffling mobile antimatter fuel factories was also important. The factories at the harbors would become unnecessary, so one might think it would be prudent to use them as resupply points, but it wouldn't work out time-wise. As such, fuel would be supplied from other star systems, and the amount that was lacking would be covered by the surplus at the harbors. Of course, the answer would be worked out by compicrystals, but it was humans who needed to think about what needed answering. That was because it was not the Thunderpeel or training fleets that were responsible for the arrangement of antimatter fuel and its production equipment, but rather the Bioer Kassabear carrier fleet. The carrier fleet maintained and developed shipping routes, with both the Empire's economy and overall defense in mind. Following the taking of the capital, they devoted themselves to rebuilding those routes, just as the training fleet strove to rebuild the Star Force's war power. If the training fleet could be likened to equipment the Empire used to regain its muscle mass, then the carrier fleet was the equipment it used to repair its body. The training fleet yielded successful results, and in the end, it created a combat corps called the Thunderpeel Fleet. However, the carrier fleet's mission was still in its early stages. The Avriel Countdom, the star system that contained Lokvakar, had been more than just the Empire's distribution center. Space-time bubble generators were necessary to cross planar space, yet it was once the only system in the Empire that produced them. It would take tremendous amounts of effort to fill that hole. As such, Leifir figured it made more sense to recapture Lokvakar, but the Emperor seemed not to agree. In any case, the carrier fleet wanted the antimatter fuel factories provided to the training fleet harbors to be returned without delay. They had all manner of uses. Glagam Byrer Kasaber, Carrier Fleet Command, had apparently reported to the Emperor that a counteroffensive would be premature. Needless to say, from the moment the Emperor's edict went into effect, they too hoped Operation Thunderpeel was a success. But that didn't mean they had any intention of acquiescing to the Thunderpeel fleet's demands all too readily. The staff officers had to spend some of their time in these sorts of negotiations. If the discussions didn't lead anywhere, they'd be unable to formulate adequate plans. Carrier Fleet Command always acted in tandem with the mobile Imperial Palace, so it was in the Limskor Udor at present. Naturally, the Thunderpeel fleet staff intended to get negotiations with the Carrier Fleet over with while they were still in Udok. To be fair, Carrier Fleet Command did cooperate. Yet they still ran out of time, and some of the staff members remained in the Viscountdom. Leifir had a different job on her plate: personnel affairs. It seemed as though Chief of Staff Sabash was still operating under the delusion that the Glaher Byrer Rodrakar, Thunderpeel Fleet Commander-in-Chief, i.e. Leifir, could and should be given direct command over Fleet 5. She had to hurry to fill the Glaher Byrer Gutta, Fleet 5 Commander-in-Chief, role, not least in order to foil that little scheme. What was formerly Training Fleet 3 had 7 Glagam Fika, secondary command centers, each headed by a vice commander-in-chief, and each supplied with squadrons under their direct control and staff officers. They were prepared to execute the commands of the fleet at any time. Their main mission was strategy research, but they also served as the command centers of the enemy forces during combat exercises. The Thunderpeel fleet inherited all 7 secondary command centers. In essence, the secondary command centers moved laterally to the command centers of the newly incorporated numbered fleets. The vice commanders-in-chief had a ranking order. And considering the importance of the Fleet 5 commander-in-chief position, it was the Bolmroy Glaherer, most senior vice commander-in-chief, that ought to be assigned to it. The patrol ship Herlath, upon which rode the most senior vice commander-in-chief of the fleet, formerly known as Training Fleet 3 and now known as the Thunderpeel Fleet, came alongside the flagship Klibnikek. And the Bolmroy Glaherer Byrer Rodrakar, Thunderpeel Fleet most senior vice commander-in-chief, who transferred from the Herlath to the Klibnikek, was none other than the Archduchess of Leitpan Star Forces Admiral Spor Aron Sakespate Penez. When Spor appeared at the room of the commander-in-chief of the Klibnikek, she didn't bother hiding her displeasure. "Ma'am, are you telling me to take command of the rear forces?" "Me? Correct." "Why is everyone so disgruntled?" thought a fed-up Leifir as she nodded. "The fighting is finally starting again. I'd also like you to defend the Wesco portal." "I'm on defense?" Spor furrowed her brow. "Do you object?" asked Leifir outright. "I am entrusting you with our lifeline here. I don't believe a Star Forces admiral should feel above that." "Oh, I would never entertain objecting, ma'am." Spor flashed a smile and lightly bowed. "I receive my appointment as Glaherer Byrer Gutta Rodrakar, Thunderpeel Fleet 5 Commander-in-Chief, with humility and respect." "I see. Please do." Relieved, Leifir shot a glance at the nearby Chief of Staff Sabash. With this, he would have to abandon his plot to make Fleet 5 the main company. Just as Leifir was accompanied by Sabash, Spor had taken her own Chief of Staff, Commodore Kvatis, with her. "Well, I suppose that task is suited to the likes of a Star Forces admiral," Spor grumbled to Kvatis in a voice too loud to be called a whisper. "It is far below the Archduchess of Leitpan." "But ma'am," said Kvatis, an expression of resignation on his face, "as Her Highness stated, it's recognized as the second highest position in the Thunderpeel fleet. Would I be amiss in assuming you would like to be the Fleet 1 Commander-in-Chief instead? That sounds like more fun, don't you think? And that's why it's not a good match for a Star Forces admiral. Your Excellency's rank would decrease. Besides, you've already served in that role. And it entertained me, so I'd like to do it again. Please don't be so self-indulgent, ma'am. And just think, if our orders are revised and we're tasked with retaking the capital using the Wesco portal as a base, our forces will become the advance guard." My. Spore's crimson eyes betrayed her keen interest. Is there a plan like that in the works? Oh no, ma'am. I'm just stating a possibility, said Kvatis. How could I be aware of a plan that Your Excellency isn't? You have a point. Spore sighed. If it means being entrusted with the Vanguard Recon Corps, I don't mind getting demoted. I'll still be the Archduchess of Latepan, after all. No matter how high-ranking any fleet position may be, even the highest is only ever commensurate to a mere Avriel. Excuse me, Lanu, said Sabash, clearly amused. Are you aware that you are still in the presence of Figlaherer? Heavens me, said Spore, not fazed in the least. No Avriel worth their salt would pay the jests of a Spore any mind. I mean no disrespect when I say that I have known Her Highness since she was a child, and that you can take it from me she is unmistakably an Avriel. Leifir didn't get the feeling she was being praised, but it didn't rub her the wrong way either. In fact, the way Sabash nodded and said, I see, was more wounding. What do you mean, you see? Leifir asked her chief of staff. I was just thinking this must be how people of the Imperial Palace socialize, replied Sabash. How could you think that? Leifir was growing yet more annoyed. Spore rose up. Indeed. I am glad that I was able to confirm that, though the capital is now lost, the relationship between the Imperial family and my clan has not changed. Come to think of it, I hear that relations between the Spores and the Avriels have been like this since before Ovkind settled in Lokvikar. Archduchess, said Leifir, unable to restrain herself, the capital is not lost. It's still right within our reach. We'll take it back shortly. It was a slip of the tongue, said Spore, bowing her head deeply. A smile was curving her lips, though I was beginning to tire of being shined on by a son by the name of Avriel. After Spore excused herself, the Baroness of Febdash, Grand Commodore Autosurius Cyan Atos Laik, was summoned. She too was one of the vice-commanders-in-chief. Fee. With a slightly awkward carriage, the Grand Commodore bowed. An odd twist of fate had brought them together. It was Leifir who had killed Atos Raiwa's brother, yet Atos Raiwa was her direct superior when Leifir was given her first ship to command. Sabash offered her a seat, Vice-Commander-in-Chief, this way, if you please. He too had a history with Atos Raiwa, having once served as her chief of staff. It was no coincidence that many of Leifir's subordinates were star pilots she had known and interacted with since times past. The star forces, vast though they were, only had a limited number of high-ranking star pilots. One of the reasons each of those high-ranking star pilots knew a lot of others was simply that they'd had occasion to meet at least once. But even more saliently, it was also the result of the deliberate designs of the Council of Abdicants. To gentry, becoming a star pilot was a right and a privilege. To Imperials and nobility, it was an obligation. For nobles, they simply couldn't inherit their noble rank without having put in military service. Moreover, when they did get ordained, they did not then have any particularly severe obligations imposed on them. Their duty to the military ended once they reached the rank of Deca Commander. There were nobles like the Archduchess of Latepan who remained in the military even after inheriting their noble rank, but they were not being forced to by the Empire. It was different for Imperials. To them, military service was a race among rivals to the crown. They were duty-bound to display their own merit, ability, and competence and rise up the ranks. In the humankind empire of Ov, the most important of the Emperor's duties was commanding the military. Leifir had never asked herself why such a race was necessary. To her, it was such a matter of course that she had never thought about what the point of it was. The Ov progenitors were created as biodroid components that powered a multi-generational spacecraft. Eventually, the founders betrayed their creators and began to recognize themselves as humans. However, although that multi-generational spacecraft became the city ship Avriel, it was still essentially the Ov's whole world, and so they were forced to maintain the biodroid aspect of themselves. The Ov only cut clean from their biodroid drudgery when the Empire was founded, which was when their world suddenly expanded from the confines of the city ship. Nevertheless, the Avriel stuck around as the Imperial Palace. Perhaps it could be said that only members of the Imperial family, the Avriels, continued to be biodroid components of a larger machine, which was not referring, of course, to the Imperial Palace, but rather to the Empire. During the fall of Lokvikar, The imperial palace was converted into the Dragon Egg Fortress and essentially became no more. However, the Avriel clan continued to regard themselves as components of the empire. To Avriels, the purpose of life was to become a more perfect gear in the empire's workings. They could take their time thinking about other things in life after they fulfilled their roles. There were a rare few Imperials who gave up on chasing the emperorship early. Life didn't become harsher for them afterward, but they gave up as a result of determining that their ability was not high enough to shoulder the empire. There was a tendency among the Avs to believe in themselves to excessive levels, and the Avriels were said to be the most Av-like clan. That was not to say modest Avriels were never born. Unfortunately, Leifir was an Avriel through and through. She didn't doubt her own skill in the slightest. The race for the throne was also a time for gaining confidence and trusted friends. It was a necessity of military service to be able to pick out capable personnel who would make for reliable and competent vassals in the future. In fact, that in itself was part of the competition, and a very important element of it at that. Consequently, a diverse variety of human resources were posted around star pilots who were Imperials. It went without saying that officers with good academic records were selected, but so too were those with unusual experiences. Occasionally, the Council of Abdicants secretly pulled strings and sent in soldiers and personnel they thought would contribute to the growth of one or more Imperials. Atos Raiwa was, in all likelihood, placed in Leifir's vicinity intentionally. But none of that mattered anymore. Leifir trusted Atos Raiwa as a soldier. She was an outstanding star pilot who had gained lots of valuable experience since the war broke out. If Leifir hadn't been an Imperial, she wouldn't have outstripped her in terms of military rank. "I want to entrust you with the Vanguard Recon Corps," said Leifir. The Fleet 1 Commander-in-Chief position that Spore wanted was thus given to Atos Raiwa. "It's a great honor," replied Atos Raiwa. "I am pleased to accept it. It's a shame I can't tell my father and brother about this." My father would have burst out laughing. What do you mean, burst out laughing?" Leifir asked her former superior officer. "From joy, of course." "I see." Leifir had met the second Baron of Febdash, Atos Raiwa's father. In fact, they had once fought on the same ship. It was only the one time, but he could be called a comrade, and there was no doubt he had helped save her life. He was also killed in action during the fall of Lokvakar. While Leifir never interacted much with the second Baron of Febdash, Jint and others were very fond of him and his personality. It was hard to believe somebody Jint esteemed and admired would laugh at his daughter's promotion. However, she decided not to pursue the matter. Leifir had not gained right-hand officers befitting her status and military rank. There was more than one reason she was considered the ad hoc crown princess, and the fact that her competence was an unknown quantity was just the most important of those reasons. Another was that she had too few confidants to support her in the event she did accede to the Jade Throne. If this were peacetime, that would simply mean she would get farther away from the throne and cede her position in the race to another, worthier Imperial. Unfortunately for the Empire, however, there was no better candidate for Emperor than Leifir in terms of talent and skill. That was due to the unusual situation engendered by the fall of the capital and the partial destruction of the Star Forces. As such, Leifir decided to leave Fleets 2 and 4 to people she was not very familiar with. Meanwhile, the Fleet 1 and Fleet 5 Glaherer were given a great deal of discretionary power. They would be too distant from the main forces to ask for orders for every little thing. On the other hand, the Glaherer Fleets 2 and 4, which were to protect both flanks of the main forces, had very little scope to exercise any sort of discretion. She could make adventurous decisions when it came to personnel affairs. If they were no good, she could replace them on a dime. Leifir decided to designate Commodore Pianzek, the Glaherer Byrer Mata, Fleet 2 Commander-in-Chief, and Commodore Desem, the Glaherer Byrer Ghana, Fleet 4 Commander-in-Chief. Both were Roy Glaherer Byrer Clayer, training Fleet Vice Commanders-in-Chief, so she had already made their acquaintance. That being said, they had become Vice Commanders-in-Chief extremely recently, and Leifir hadn't met them before they did. From what she could tell from her erstwhile superior officers' evaluations, there was nothing to criticize regarding competence, But she couldn't trust such reports unconditionally. There was still not enough data for Lafier to make definitive assessments. Commodore Pianzek had moved from the Bosor military administration base to take his new post. It seemed he had spent his career primarily in the field of military administration. Many expected him to become the military administration director in the future. For that reason, he needed to spend some time working on the front lines. When Pianzek appeared before Lafier, he appeared a tad nervous. "I stand humbled," he said, in a very formal register. He was the youngest of the vice commanders-in-chief, but he was still older than Lafier. Pianzek seemed deeply moved when she told him that she wanted to leave Fleet 2 to him. "I am truly honored. I will exert myself to the utmost in service." Lafier was relieved he reacted as she'd hoped. "Right," said Lafier. "We expect great things." Commodore Dasef being entrusted with Fleet 4 was an internal training fleet promotion. Apparently, he had spent most of his military career as an instructor. His previous job was as a Kaseriak Uariakot, teacher staff officer, in the nursery fleet, i.e. Training Fleet 1. Physical aging was a thing of the past for the OV, so even the OV themselves had trouble telling how old other OVs were by outward appearance. To Lafier, Dasef looked like a boy who was right on the verge of adolescence, or in other words, around the time when the rate of growth began to slow down, in the mid-teens. Yet he was the oldest of the vice commanders-in-chief, and in that way the opposite of Pianzek. The OV's relative maturity was not manifest in their appearances, but rather in their demeanor. "Congratulations on your new post, Glaherer." He bowed, the picture of calm. "Thanks," said Lafier. "Pianzek just told me he became Fleet 2 Commander-in-Chief," said Dasef, "so I suppose you will be granting me Fleet 4, ma'am." "That's correct." Dasef beamed. "I humbly accept." "We're counting on you," Lafier nodded. "Are you friends with Commodore Pianzek?" "He is a former pupil of mine, ma'am." One moment, I find we have the same rank, and the next, I find that even our job descriptions are the same. Is that a tricky position for you to be in? "Perish the thought," said Dasef, smiling precociously. "Why, it would not bother me one bit if your highness was an old pupil of mine."